get to know a little bit more about you. How did you end up in this space?
I first discovered crypto in 2010 when I was running a bank in India, and one of my back office tech guys said to me, "Madam, have you seen this thing called Bitcoin? You should buy some." It's interesting also because he told me when he built the internet, the first thing he got told to do was shut it down. And he was like, "Government can't do that because it's open."
New technologies, as always.
Can't do it. I can't because it's an open system. Then he said 10 years later they came to him and said, "How do we buy it?" And he goes, "Can't do that either." And then in about 2012 I went back to Australia, and my very good friend was running the Australian regulator, Greg Metcalfe. And he said to me this day, "Have you looked at this thing called blockchain?" And because he said, "I think it's going to revolutionise financial markets."
When you got your exposure to Bitcoin, it wasn't even the actual Bitcoin white paper. You actually heard it from other people to get to know what Bitcoin is?
Yeah, so you read the 9 pages of the PDF. There's 4 lines in it which are blindingly obvious about what Bitcoin was meant to be. Had Bitcoin been called Zen token, nobody would have cared. But the minute you put coin or currency into a wording, you upset different buckets of regulators. So the central banks got upset because they thought the monetary system was going to collapse.
If you have one more nugget that you want to tell the audience, what would you say?
If anybody in 2024 thinks that Bitcoin's going to zero, I don't know what planet you're on, but you should go move to Mars because that's not happening. Because this asset class is now cemented. It's cemented and we have to interact with it, whether we like it or we don't.
So welcome to the TheRealZeall podcast. This is my very honored time because I am having one of my closest friends in the regulatory space, Loretta here, that knowing a lot about regulation, did a lot for the crypto space. And yeah, it's very honored for me to actually interview you and get others in the space to know more about you. So thank you for coming.
Thank you, Anson.
Yeah, so from what since 2019, we've been working quite a lot in terms of the travel rule. You were working a lot on your side, and then we've started crossing paths when we start working on the G20 in Indonesia. But before that, let's get to know a little bit more about you. Describe a bit about yourself. How did you end up in this space?
So it was a long journey and it's been a decade. So my name is Loretta Joseph. I spent, I think, 30 years of my life being a derivatives trader, which was a good prelude, I guess, to crypto. So I first discovered crypto in 2010 when I was running a bank in India, and one of my back office tech guys said to me, "Madam, have you seen this thing called Bitcoin? You should buy some." And I was like, yeah. And then I didn't cross my mind. And then in about 2012, I went back to Australia, and my very good friend was running the Australian regulator, Greg Metcalfe. And we used to catch the bus together. Yes, the regulator catches the bus, and we have kids the same age. And he said to me this day, "Have you looked at this thing called blockchain?" And because he said, "I think it's going to revolutionise financial markets." And I went away, and I actually, for some stupid reason, I thought he said Minecraft. So I spent an entire weekend on Minecraft wondering how it was going to change the world. But when I called him on the Monday, he was like, what are you talking about? So then he said, no, I'm talking about blockchain. And then I read the blockchain.
When was this? What year was this?
This was end of 2012, so 2013.
2013.
Yeah,
wow.
Really long time ago. And I looked at blockchain then, not because of Bitcoin, but because I looked at the atomic swapping of Bitcoin. And I read this book called The Blockchain Revolution. And being a trader, when you trade derivatives, the biggest bugbear you have is when you have P&Ls. And everything's manual. All the back office processes are manual. So you never know, trading and clearing and settlement. Trading is instantaneous, but clearing and settlement takes forever. And I looked at blockchain and the atomic swapping of a Bitcoin, and I thought, imagine if we could atomically swap a financial product. So I looked at it, and I remember I was doing some consulting work for a stock exchange in Australia, and I looked at the Corporation Act, and it referred to a software for clearing and settlement the Australian Stock Exchange used. And I thought, hang on, how can you have a software in a law? And laws should be technology agnostic. So I went to the Treasury and I said, you can't have like the chess settlement of which the ASX uses as a clearing settlement system. You can't have that written into a law. Anyway, I went back to Greg and he gave me regulatory relief because the regulator can do that.
Who is Greg?
Greg Metcalf, he ran ASIC. So we actually had the chess removed from the Corporations Act in 2013. That was my opening into policy because I'm not a policy writer or a regulator. I've been regulated by 50 jurisdictions. But that led me into then looking deeply into blockchain. And then I was trying to figure out what Bitcoin was. Like I was like, what is this thing? So I spent a couple of years running around the world meeting the strangest people, like in university courtyards in Moscow, in the slums of Delhi, in back alleys of San Paulo, in pinball parlours in New York, trying to figure out what Bitcoin was. And then the interesting thing I worked out when I figured out what was behind Bitcoin, and it all come out of game theory, and it was a bunch of technologists that live on the spectrum, and looking at them, and they're a bunch of young kids who had always, lived in their garages of their parents, interacting with each other online. So trying to have a conversation with anybody that is in the blockchain space in 2012 was very, very difficult because most of them are on the spectrum. And then having them try to explain to a regulator or a policymaker what the hell a cryptocurrency was, I could see was problematic.
2012 is definitely very early. And what price was Bitcoin back then?
I think $40.
$40.
And then it was interesting because none of these kids had any money. I mean, I remember going into pinball parlours in New York and buying Cokes and pizzas, and trying to understand what was behind Bitcoin and what the asset was. And then, because I knew nothing about open systems, I was a banker, and we traded derivatives before we had mobile devices and computers. So we used to literally trade with pieces of paper and calculators. So, when we moved from floor trading in 1999 to computer trading, we had to build systems. And none of us knew how to build computer systems. We learned very quickly to take the buy button away from the sell button, because if you put them too close together, you're going to have all sorts of problems.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I learned from the ground up, and then I didn't understand open systems. Like I didn't understand how the internet was built. So I Googled who built the internet, and Bob Kahn came up, Robert Kahn, and he's the father of the internet. So I don't know how I got it, but I got his number and I rang him. And I said, "Hello, Bob, I'm Loretta Joseph from Australia. I need to understand how you built the internet." And he promptly hung up on me. So I called him back, and then for whatever reason, he said, "Well, come to Washington," because all of this technology I figured out came out of DARPA, of US Defence. And if you look at where blockchain had come from, and I'd done a lot of research on the CryptoPunks who came out of the 1960s, and a guy called Nick Zeall who talked about digital gold in 1973. But Bob, interestingly, sent the first message across an open system to Vincent, which created the internet, the transmission control protocol and the internet protocol, and that was hello. So then I've spent for the last 10 years with Bob understanding stuff about computer science and and engineering that I don't really need to know about. But his wife, Patrice Newell, and she is a Princeton lawyer and she teaches at Princeton. Without her, we wouldn't have had the internet. And she taught me very early that if she had not have started to write regulations around the internet, what her husband, who was a simple electrical engineer that worked for DARPA, we wouldn't have the internet. So without Bob and Patrice, who nobody knows, the internet would not be what it is today, and we wouldn't be having this conversation, or we wouldn't have mobile devices.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and it was interesting because he taught me that on top of the mobile device that we use, there's about 198 protocols. So the first protocol he wrote was the transmission control protocol and the internet protocol. So all these different protocols are built on top of it. None of us know that because it's just an infrastructure. We all use our mobile devices. If we've got kids, that trying to get the mobile device out of their left hand is almost impossible. But that created the concept of open systems and transferring information across open systems.
So what's very interesting, you were saying that Bitcoin came along?
Yeah, so when Bitcoin came along, whatever you think about Bitcoin, I always say this to regulators and policymakers and central bank governors, put aside what you think of it as a speculative asset. What blockchain came along with the inception of Bitcoin. So the first application was Bitcoin. Now since World War II, we had encryption. So the Allied forces used to use encrypted data when they were fighting at World War II. So you had encryption in about 1946. The internet came in when Bob started to build it, not in 1971. But the problem with the internet, and he taught me, was when it was built for DARPA in the US, he was told not to put a security protocol layer into it. And that's a very interesting thing. So when Bitcoin came along, it actually put a security protocol layer on top of the internet.
How come he decided not to? Why was he
because the US defense didn't want it to be secure.
Oh, interesting.
So it was a very interesting concept. So when Bitcoin came along, nothing to do with DARPA, it added a security protocol layer onto open systems. So now all of a sudden with Bitcoin, and as we know, as the technology gets more advanced, we can now move information and data across open systems, which is secure, because of the whole concept of decentralization and the consensus mechanism of these this blockchain technology. So that's particularly interesting, and I was fascinated by it. Bob also told me that he'd written a paper on a central bank digital currency in 1974, and he took it to the Federal Reserve, and they said, "Oh, you can't. No, you need to get this patent." And he was like, "Oh, I can't patent something that's open." But it was interesting also because he told me when he built the internet, the first thing he got told to do was shut it down. And he was like, government can't do that because it's open.
New technologies, as always.
Can't do it. I can't because it's an open system. Then he said 10 years later they came to him and said, how do we buy it? And he goes, can't do that either. So it was an interesting infrastructure. So if you look at blockchain from an infrastructure layer, it's particularly interesting. Bitcoin, as a speculative asset, and then what came afterwards with Ethereum, with smart contracts, really started to interest me because I figured out with Ethereum, the business now of Bitcoin does one thing and one thing only. It transfers Bitcoin as value across an open system very securely, but it's very clunky. It's very slow. It takes 10 minutes to do a transaction. That's because it wasn't built to be a payment system. And cryptocurrency, that's the wrong word. And I think when Satoshi Nakamoto came up with that, nobody thought through borrowing terms from other parts of financial markets. So the word cryptocurrency upsets central banks. The minute you put currency or coin into anything, you send central bank governors into some sort of flurry. And then crypto exchanges borrow the term from security exchanges, which are public-private partnerships, but they're not exchanges. They're matching engines.
So basically, when you got your exposure to Bitcoin, it wasn't even the actual Bitcoin white paper. You actually heard it from other people to get to know what Bitcoin is?
Yeah. So, and then I read the white paper and it made sense. Because if I had read the white paper, not been an electrical engineer and not understanding too much about mathematics, although I was a derivatives trader, it made no sense. But if you read the 9 pages of the PDF, there's 4 lines in it which are blindingly obvious about what Bitcoin was meant to be. And when it talks about being a peer-to-peer cashless system, I think they use the wrong words because it's a global money system. Now, money means something different to everybody. Money isn't fiat currency, and we used to barter gold and shells and potatoes and whatever long before we had pieces of paper with people's head stamps on it, and long before pieces of paper with people's head stamped on it was backed by gold, and now it's not backed by anything. Money is very different to currency. And I think this is where the confusion comes because the crypto community borrowed terms that were
like copy and paste.
Copied and paste, and it didn't work because it upset regulators and policymakers who didn't understand the technology, and it was the wrong terminology. Had Bitcoin been called Zen token, nobody would have cared. Nobody would have cared. But the minute you put coin or currency into a wording, you upset different buckets of regulators.
Correct.
So the central banks got upset because they thought the monetary system was going to collapse. And if you read the definition of legal tender, which is what we have today with pieces of paper with people's head stamps on it, which doesn't mean too much, but it is what it is. If you read the definition, it's a store of value, a means of payment, and a unit of transfer. Or the 3 legal definitions. Bitcoin, Ethereum, none of them fit that. Bitcoin might be a store of value, Ethereum might be a payment system, but there is not one cryptocurrency to date that actually fits the definition of fiat currency. So take it out of the mandate of central banks. And then, so in 2014, I was trying to figure out what we should call this thing because Bitcoin sounded stupid. And we came up in Australia actually with the term digital assets. Now, as my history and how this all has progressed since then, we probably shouldn't have used that, but we were the first jurisdiction where the Attorney General, we all sat down, the Finance Minister, and we said, what is this thing? It's a digital asset. But learning from experience, and this was in 2014 when this was still so young, and I could probably name the 200 people in crypto back in 2014 because we all knew each other, because we were such a small community and everybody knew everybody. So the term digital asset was too broad because we can now digitalise anything. Any asset can be digitalised, whether it be a fixed income, an equity, a land title, a property, or anything can be digitalised. So the word digital asset is far too broad for a cryptocurrency.
And I think back then, somehow the community wanted to, they have the narrative to try and take over the monetary system. Yeah. I think this was done way too early, and that shouldn't have been the first narrative to actually push this technology.
And the fact that the Bitcoin white paper says a peer-to-peer cashless system, it's interesting in the fact if you look at how it upset the Wall Streets, like because obviously things like Bitcoin and they're disruptors. Technology is always disruptors, but when you disintermediate markets, so if you atomically swap assets like Bitcoin, the friction in systems goes. And what do intermediaries do? They make money out of friction in systems.
Correct, yeah.
So the minute Bitcoin was called Bitcoin, and the banks all went up in a big flurry, and they were like, oh, this can't be done. And they're big lobbyist groups as well, So they were the first, I guess, target that really, 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 really became very anti-Bitcoin was the banking system because they thought it was going to take them over. Now, look at the internet. When, the internet closed down brick and mortar banks didn't shut down. We all use banks.
The added value right now.
Added value,
yes.
But they've just changed their business models.
Yes.
And now, as we see with all technology and things like Uber and Airbnb, the decentralised nature of how technology is evolving has actually made the customer centric to everything. So you can be a customer in the poorest country in the world or the richest country in the world. You are still very important in these business models. So all industries have had to have a rethink about their business models, and banks are not going to go away. Let's all be frank. There's still going to be, people like me, the Gen X, and we're all going to use fiat currency at some point. So banks really, really, really took it the wrong way, and they were big lobby groups against Bitcoin.
Great, yeah, exactly. Because back then, 2014, you had to download the whole ledger in order to actually store Bitcoin properly. So from that perspective, banks were were very scared, but the technology wasn't even ready for commercial use.
I've given Bitcoin to people that have cut my hair, taxi drivers in New York. I've given more Bitcoin away because it didn't matter. To me, it was just a social experiment, and I still believe it's probably the biggest social experiment that we've seen in our lifetimes. But the narrative was wrong. You're right. The Bitcoin narrative was very wrong, that it was going to take over monetary systems. And that was never going to happen. But what it did do, and this is the thing why I'm so passionate about it now, because over the 10 years I've seen the technology go from a very small group of people to being very, very, very nascent but to where it is now. And it's globally accepted by everyone. So I can be sitting in Lagos, Nigeria, I can transfer Bitcoin to somebody in the Philippines. It's globally, as an asset, it's transfer. It can be used by nobody can control it. No bank's an intermediary. Nobody's making money out of friction in systems. The disintermediation of markets is very powerful.
So I know you do a lot of work in Nigeria. Would you like to describe some of the stuff that you've done?
So in Nigeria, I work with the Financial Intelligence Unit. So in my process in the last 10 years, I probably, if you had told me in 2014 that I would know anything about money laundering, terrorism, financing, rules and regulations set by standard set of the world, I would have laughed at you. And that I'd be working with law enforcement agencies, I would have laughed even harder or probably cried. So my journey since 2014 put me into policy. So when we came up with the concept of digital assets in Australia and we removed CHESS out of the Corporations Act, it threw me into this realm of policy. And I'm not a lawyer, for everybody to just know that. I'm not a lawyer, but I think most lawyers struggle with legal concepts, so I probably wouldn't have been able to do a lot of the stuff that I've done if I was a lawyer. So that took me to about 2017, and up until 2017, I don't think there was a lot of scammers in this industry. I think the first evolution of cryptocurrencies and smart contract with Ethereum, Bitcoin, all we had to worry about in 2017 was a couple of cryptocurrencies. The scammers and the cryptocurrencies that came later weren't in the market.
This is very interesting because there was a study now that said that most of the scams became fiat, and we heard about scams only in the few recent years. So it seems like there is some sort of overlap where these scammers have learned from the industry to that. Maybe speculation, but the word scam didn't come up that often before.
And if there's a movie on Netflix, actually, it's about these scammers they produced a coin. I can't remember what. I watched it last week with my daughter. And these guys were scammers. They were scammers for years and years and years. And crypto just came along and they just took it as something to cling on to. So they knew nothing about crypto, and they created some sort of fake website, and they took some guy's photo off, and he had a CEO, and it became quite legitimate in 2017, and they did an ICO. So in 2017, 2018, it became very interesting with this ecosystem because none of these companies could raise money. And nobody other than their families and their friends would give them money. No venture capitalists, no banks would trust them. So I think the crypto community is very, very good at being versatile and adapting. So they went, all right, well, if nobody's venture capitalists and no banks are going to give us money, we'll create our own system to build our companies and fund them. So that's when initial coin offerings came up. So crypto was funded by people, writing these things called white papers, which were sort of like business plans, whacking them on the internet and saying, we're going to build the next Google 50, go and give us some money. And they could go out to any person in the world on a website and get money in crypto. Now, the problem with that was that all these scammers came because it was a very easy way to make money, and there was no regulations. And securities regulators and all the standard setters were not understanding that these ICOs, which sounded like IPOs, people were just not getting equity in them. So they could not get their head around these things you could go and put into a project or a company but not get any equity. So there was a big disconnect between the regulators and the industry. And I remember this in 2017, I was at the World Economic Forum. Anyway, I met David Burt, who was the Premier of Bermuda, and somehow or other, overnight he convinced me to go to Bermuda, and we wrote the first ever laws. Malta had written some stuff in Gibraltar, but ours was the first ever comprehensive law on digital asset service provider laws, and we did it in Bermuda in 3 months. So don't anybody ever tell me that a country can't write law, because we went there, we did 3 months, and we wrote the first law on initial coin offerings. Because when I looked at them, and I'm a trader, I've traded every asset class, I figured out they were not equity offerings. So regulators couldn't understand how people could buy. They weren't getting equity in companies, but they were funding this project. And because there was no regulation, people were scamming. The amount of money, I think in 2018 that people were raising in initial coin offerings hit $7 billion.
Yes, it was staggering. The number was huge.
And everybody was giving money, and there was no regulation to stop it. And most of this stuff, like 99% of these things, were scams. I could be a 16-year-old kid in a garage, go on one white paper, tell someone I was going to build the next Google 50, do not anything particularly exciting and raise $20 million, then shut down the website and run off to a beach. So we wrote that in Bermuda, and I think that was a catalyst that other regulators started to understand the intricacies of people buying into these initial coin offerings with crypto. And they weren't equities.
This is very interesting because I remember back then many of the ICOs basically launched with even just 8 pages. Even one of the exchanges we see today, they also launched with just just saying what their vision is. So but this was
it was
important.
Insane. And I met this kid in Serbia who was 14, had done a white paper on some coin. He raised $36 million.
36.
million US dollars at 14. I'm going, oh, this is not good. And I still don't understand what the coin did. So I think, so then after that, a lot of the scams started to die down once there started to be proper regulation around ICOs. But then you got this new wave of complete scammers. So
Yes.
crypto changed from all what we call them the OGs, the original crypto guys, who were very what's the word? Like they're very utopian, I think, and they do have a belief that the world can be a much better place if it's democratized, and anybody in the world can access the Bitcoin network. You go on, you download it. Anybody can send Bitcoin to anyone. There's no intermediaries. That was a very different vision. So the next generation after that initial group of cryptocurrency people became much more scammy. It really, the ecosystem really changed, and I think for the worst. And we saw consumers being frauded and investors losing money. Really bad things started to happen after that initial ICO boom of 2017.
It is very true. So we're at the FATF, Private Sector Consultative Forum, and the first session was about how one of them was Singapore, how they set up the scam center, and they have to work with banks, work with everyone. It's now become a big issue. Did it fully come out? Do you think it fully came out from the crypto space?
No,
or the
I think technology is used by everybody. And I've learned this over the years. The bad guys are very, very good at being organised. Very good. And us on the good side, we're not particularly good at being organised. But, we saw that with Mt. Gox back, in the day when, people were buying stuff on the dark web with crypto. There were certainly things that are bad, but bad guys will always try and find a way to be bad. And technology is the best way to do it.
Yeah, they're very good at innovating to be bad.
Yes, be ahead of the curve. And
Yes.
we on the right side are not very good at that. So then, when we wrote the Digital Asset Business Act in Bermuda in 2018, that digital assets was the only term of reference I had. So the standard setters, now we've got the Financial Stability Board that look after financial stability, that came out of the GFC, which was one of the catalysts, I think, of why Bitcoin came into existence, to be quite frank. And then the Financial Action Task Force, who are the money laundering, terrorism financing standard setter. They came out in 2019, which was very interesting. IOSCO is the standard setter for securities, so they look after consumer investor protection. But the FATF was the first standard setter to come out with a proper definition of a cryptocurrency, which they called a virtual asset. So their definition in 2019, and this was after I'd started writing law and jurisdiction, so it became quite complicated because I didn't know anything about AML, CTF requirements of this stuff.
I think a lot in the space did not know. They had to adapt and learn.
We had to adapt and learn. So when the FATF said a virtual asset is a digital representation of value that can be traded, transferred or used as a unit of payment or for investment purposes, and a virtual asset service provider is somebody that provides services for that. That was the first ever clear definition that anybody in the world as a standard setter come out with.
Yeah.
So if you take that and then, so that is particularly clear. And the FATF go on to say, if you're the digital representation of a fixed income product or an equity, you are already covered. We're going to start pulling in our kids who are playing the equivalent of a Pokemon game for money laundering, terrorism financing.
You can't include everything,
right?
You
can't include everything. Definitions can't be completely so broad and wide. They have to have a finish and a beginning. The FATF, I think, were very, very, very far ahead of the curve, and they'd actually been looking at virtual assets since 2012, long before any other standard setter had even looked at this stuff.
What caused them to start looking at it back then?
Mt. Gox. So you
Mt. Gox.
So you had the dark web usage for illicit things, buying whatever, and they were using cryptocurrency. I mean, it was a very good business model. The guy that did it, by the fact that he was a criminal, it was a really interesting use case. So Mt. Gox and the use of the dark web triggered the FATF to start looking at it. But they didn't understand technology, and nobody really did, to be quite honest. And technology has moved so quickly. In the 10 years I've been in this space, when I first started to write laws and regulations in 2017, to be honest, we had to worry about was Bitcoin, Ethereum, and a few of the shitcoins.
Yes.
But fast forward to 2024, regulators are still worrying about that. We've got DeFi, we've got non-fungible tokens, we've got decentralized automated organizations. What is coming out of this ecosystem is so powerful and so revolutionary that we can't look at the past, we've got to look what's coming ahead of us. And I think this is the problem, that regulators are slow, and that's not their fault, because regulators are not technologists and technologists are not regulators. But the problem we're having is that nobody talks. And this is what I saw when I got into the ecosystem, that I had to be a bridge between these guys on the spectrum that didn't wear socks and brush their teeth to central bank governors and regulators who would never in a million years have a conversation with a kid that was developing some sort of project in his parents' garage. They're two worlds that have never met. So it's been a very interesting journey, because we can only write these rules and for the new generations if we work together. And regulators in the old school, they're still looking at policies about what affects us. I mean, I learned everything I learned in a book at university, and we had drawers we'd pull out and go, you're going to have to go and get a book and a chapter. Mobile devices have changed everything about who we are, how we interact with each other, peer-to-peer. So getting back to your question on Nigeria. So I actually met the Nigerian law enforcement, I think at an FATF event in 2017. I don't know why I was there, but I was. And I remember having a conversation with the Financial Intelligence Unit, and the Nigerian Central Bank banned Bitcoin in 2019. The Central Bank put an outright ban on cryptocurrencies. You've got to be very careful of unintended consequences when you look at these new technologies and the emerging trends. So what did that do? That had the complete opposite effect of stopping people using Bitcoin. It all just went underground and peer-to-peer.
Yes.
They woke up in 2020 and worked out they had 120 million users of Bitcoin generally, because the banking system was so fractured and broken, and it's got like this parallel economy of cash in a banking system. But if anyone's been to Nigeria and you try and get money out of an ATM machine, you try and get $200 out of an ATM machine, you've probably got to go to 10 ATM machines. Each ATM machine will charge you 14%. It's so dysfunctional.
Oh, wow.
So not everybody in Nigeria using Bitcoin is a terrorist or money laundering. It's used for simple transfer of value.
But before crypto or Bitcoin came about, how were the lives of Nigerians like in terms of payments? Is it like what you said, like
cash.
ATMs?
You go to the side of the road and there's a guy that can apparently change it up to $1 billion US for you in US cash. So everything was is US dollars, but they have all these people on the side of the road that change money. So the banking system was very fractured. So that was an unintended consequence. So then they figured out they had all these people using Bitcoin. Now, not all of them were terrorists or money launderers, but we had to figure out a way to start to monitor this stuff. So if you look at jurisdictions that were pushed into looking at virtual assets, it wasn't because they had the luxury of Citibank going, oh, we don't need regulation, nothing needs to happen because this thing will probably disappear. If anybody in 2024 thinks that Bitcoin's going to zero, I don't know what planet you're on, but you should go move to Mars, because that's not happening. Because this asset class is now cemented. It's cemented, and we have to interact with it, whether we like it or we don't. So in Nigeria, they just, they have very good ways of tracking and tracing illicit movements on crypto. And that's what everybody forgets. Because a blockchain is an immutable, transparent ledger that everybody can see and everybody can access, if you're trying to launder money, it's probably the worst thing in the world, because you can track and trace every Bitcoin or every cryptocurrency that moves on a public ledger.
That's why most of the laundering in total today is still in cash.
I can stand, I lived in India for many, many years. You can stand on the border of India and move cash into Pakistan, and you're never going to be able to track or trace that movement, because you and I can change money. You can walk outside and give it to 6 other people. You can't track and trace cash. Cash is very, very difficult. So money launderers have worked out now that cryptocurrency is a very stupid thing to use. But cash is king. When it comes to money laundering and terrorism financing, cash is the worst thing that you can try and control, because you can't track and trace.
So maybe it's the same for scammers. They learned the skills from crypto and then found out, wow, it's too transparent. I have the skills now, so I move it back to the traditional world.
But the problem is that the in law enforcement agencies and the regulators hadn't figured that out up until very recently, that this was probably the best law enforcement tool that they'd ever seen, because they could never track and trace cash. But that Bitcoin, and there's the forensics on, there's companies like Elliptic and Chain Analysis which do unbelievable forensics on the blockchain. Everything is so transparent.
Yes.
So the education piece I've found in the last decade has been the hardest thing that I've had to do. And I've said to central bank governors, would you like some Bitcoin? And they've gone, oh, no. And I'm like, so you're going to ban something that you don't even know how it works. You can't even let me show you. Give me a telephone. Let me give you something. Let's see how easy this is for every man in the world to use. And that's been the problem, that people are trying to regulate something they don't understand or they don't want to understand. So that to me is been the biggest barrier of a proper regulation for cryptocurrencies and the whole blockchain ecosystem.
Yes, that's why
biggest barrier.
I think it's important that every regulator actually transacts in Bitcoin or in blockchain to actually understand how to do it properly.
Yes, and the Nigerians are particularly good at this. I mean, we can ring fence wallets. So when they have issues with terrorism, big problems in West Africa, terrorism. But if you can ring fence people's wallets from and geolocate it with a device, your problem solved. And regulators and law enforcement agencies are becoming very, very savvy with this. Very, very savvy. But then we have other issues that the different standard setters have different agendas, and at the moment, so you and I both work with the FATF and the FSB. So if you go and look at the definition, the Financial Stability Board talk about crypto assets. The Financial Action Task Force talk about virtual assets. And then you've got IOSCO talking about digital assets, which includes everything beyond cryptocurrencies, everything you digitalise. Now, the FATF definition and the FSB definition is exactly the same. Now, why the FSB called them a crypto asset, they don't even know. So we've got this big problem with definitions, that nobody's using the same definitions. Everyone's talking about the same thing but calling it something else. So the poor industry is going, well, what are we meant to do? Like, how do you be compliant? So you've got that as one problem. The second problem is that very few jurisdictions actually have regulations and licensing. And if you're a company that is trying to do the right thing, and you go and set up in a jurisdiction that's got no regulation or very light touch regulation, you can't move back to a jurisdiction that's got proper regulation. So it's a two-sided sword for the industry. They need to be regulated. Most of them, 99% of the industry, want to be regulated, but there's very few jurisdictions that have actually licensed and regulated this asset class.
This is a good segue because recently President Rajakumar has said less than 30% of all jurisdictions have a VASP, CASP, or whatever digital asset, VASP, CASP, and VASP regime. Why do you think this is the case?
Because, as I said, a lot of these countries are grappling with what they're actually regulating. And so this is a good segue into something that I've been thinking about since I first got into policy 10 years ago. I'm Australian. And I lived in India for a long time. And I looked around the world of which law systems we use. And I'm not a lawyer, but I tell you what, I've learned a lot about law. So I thought maybe in 2015, I had this blinding moment where I thought, imagine if we could have in common law a legal framework around virtual assets or digital assets. At the time I didn't know what to call it, but now virtual assets. So because the Commonwealth is common law, 2.5 billion people sit under common law jurisdictions. 1.6 billion of those people are under 30. So I thought, imagine if you could have a common framework that could go across any country that had exactly the same law system in one go. So for the last year and a half, I've worked for the Commonwealth Secretariat, and being in a group of amazing people, wrote the model law for virtual assets for the Commonwealth. And we specifically did it on virtual assets because there's a defined definition of the FATF, and most of those countries in the Commonwealth do not have regulatory or legal frameworks.
So when you say Commonwealth, are these ex-UK colonies or is it anyone can join?
So the Commonwealth is an interesting enigma. There's few people. It's not controlled by the King of England, although he's the head of it. It was initially put together by the UK. It was their ex-colonies, but over time, it's just transformed into a trade organisation. There's 56 members of the Commonwealth. Most of them speak English. Now we've got a couple of French-speaking countries that come. Anybody can join the Commonwealth, but it's countries specifically that have common law. So it's not run by the royal family. It's just a very large trade organisation. In fact, it's the biggest in the world. So now that we've got a model law, it's not set in stone. So a country, if they've already got a regulatory and legal framework, they don't have to take it. But we found many, many countries, of the 56 countries, I think 47 in the Commonwealth, do not have a regulatory or legal framework that covers off their FATF compliance risks.
Oh, so basically the model law that you wrote, is it compatible even going forward with the FATF guidance?
It is completely compatible with recommendation 15 and 16, and that's why we wrote it, because it's nothing more than a tool kit. It gives countries, they can take all of it, some of it, none of it. It's not binding, it's a model law, but it's a toolkit for countries that do not have the resources or afford to have 1,500 lawyers sitting in their Attorney General's office, to have a toolkit which makes them compliant with recommendation 15 and 16.
Wow, that's amazing. So can you explain a little bit more about what 15 and 16 are?
So recommendation 15 is, the FATF has 40 recommendations around money laundering, terrorism financing, which have been in existence for decades now. Up until 2019, none of those recommendations addressed virtual assets. Since 2019, and the FATF came out with a particular definition around virtual assets, many of these recommendations now include virtual assets. So recommendation 1, 3, 6, 8, I can name them all, 15 to 21, 28. There is over 15 recommendations that specifically refer to virtual assets, to the definition I gave you. And that's very difficult for countries that don't understand what their obligations are. But recommendation 15 is the big one, because it talks about new technologies, which is blockchain. The emerging risks we're seeing for money laundering, terrorism financing, emerging technologies. And that gives a slew of requirements around customer due diligence, KYC, enhanced customer due diligence if you're dealing with high-risk jurisdictions. There's 28 subcategories of recommendation 15. It's, even if you understand how these recommendations are, it's very difficult to know all of them. So we effectively transposed recommendation 16 into a legal framework, and the FATF says if you've got virtual asset service providers in your jurisdiction, you must register or license them. Now, there's a vast difference between registering and licensing. In my humble opinion, because I've done this a long time, I think registering these virtual asset service providers doesn't give you good regulatory oversight of their activities. I think licensing is much better. And in some jurisdictions, they've gone as far as registering and licensing. So we give in the law, if you just want to register virtual asset service providers, have a register of them, that's your little column. If you want to license them, you've got a slew of stuff you have to do. And that's about having money laundering officers, enhanced customer due diligence, total compliance requirements. And the issue is that many of these virtual asset service providers have come out of startups. Like these kids, they're technologists. Telling them that they have now responsibilities to the Financial Action Task Force around money laundering, terrorism financing is very new to many of them. So we have to retrain an entire ecosystem around compliance. Banks do compliance very well because, some of them do, but I would argue sometimes that they don't either. Compliance is a very, very tricky component of running a business. Now, if you're a small business and you've never heard of the FATF, which in 2019 I don't think most of the crypto community had, and when they were told that they had money laundering, terrorism financing compliance requirements, they didn't understand it. So there's a huge learning curve for companies to understand what their compliance responsibilities are. If they're in a jurisdiction where they're licensed, if they're registered, they just register, and I think that's quite dangerous. Recommendation 16 is another recommendation. Now, this one gets very tricky, and we're going to have many, many more talks about this, because recommendation is effectively the SWIFT equivalent for the virtual asset world. Now, the SWIFT system means that if I'm transferring in my bank money to Anson, I know my bank knows who I am, and his bank knows who he is. And before we transfer the money, they do all these KYC checks, make sure we're not, politically exposed people, we're not terrorists, we're not money launderers. There's a SWIFT. But SWIFT works because it's been around for a very long time, and banks trust each other, very trusted environment. So now the FATF has said, we're going to put these same requirements as SWIFT into the virtual asset service provider world. The difficulty with this is that you're dealing with an ecosystem where nobody trusts anybody. How do you know that a virtual asset service provider is actually a virtual asset service provider? So every time an exchange, say Coinbase, sends a transaction, and I'm using Coinbase, to Kraken that Anson's using, they go and check us, and they have to know who's behind the wallet address. So that's what recommendation 16 is. It sounds good, but we're all grappling now with the implementation of this from a regulatory stance and also from an industry stance, because the issue I see is SWIFT, we just send financial data and it's in a closed loop system. The SWIFT people all trust each other. Does it work particularly well? I don't think sometimes, but it's a trusted system. So now we have to do this in an untrusted world with an untrusted group of people. Some jurisdictions have a travel rule requirement, most don't. So then there's a sleuth of problems which come out of that, like the sunrise problem, which we call, if I need to confirm, if I'm Kraken, that I'm sending a transaction to somebody that's in Lithuania and they're asleep. Crypto works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This becomes very, very problematic. Banks close. And it becomes very problematic. And then we're now transferring personal data, so they have to know that I'm KYC, who I am behind a wallet. So we're sending personal data and financial data across open systems to people that may or may not be who they say they are. So, Abbas might be North Korea. We don't know. So we've got to work through this. The FATF had said categorically that this will be implemented, and it has to be done this year. So industry is pretty good at being compliant with this stuff because they're technologists. So I think we will solve it. But the travel rule is probably one of the most problematic regulatory requirements we have from the regulatory side, because how many regulators understand that are sitting in a securities regulator in a jurisdiction that now has virtual asset service provider regulation? How do they understand that the technology actually works, and how do they tick the box that the virtual asset service provider is sending the right information to somebody in another jurisdiction that they don't know?
Not only that, so as a compliance officer for DTC, we are always grappling with the fact, if we're working with other VASPs, how do we know that VASP is reliable if we don't actually know that we do our research for that particular country? If they don't have a licensing regime, they say they're VASP, it's very hard to share the information.
It's very difficult. So now we're going to have this stoppage in the system of transferring the information. It's going to be very problematic. And as I said, in my own personal opinion, there needs to be, because blockchain is decentralized, there needs to be some way of using the technology that has a baseline, like a company of registrars. Every country has a company of registrars. Having a registered list of virtual asset service providers globally, that every VASP can go and check if they've got a request, to send information or send a transaction information to another VASP, that VASP actually exists. And we need to use the technology to do things like we call, there's sharding. So blockchain allows you to send information to people that you don't trust to someone you don't trust. That's why blockchain works, because you can send information in an open network that's sharded that to someone you don't know, so it's secure. So it's what we call sharding or hashing. There's many, many different terms, but we can actually do it. But that's going to take a bit of time. And in the meantime, so we're worrying about recommendation 15 and 16. Now we've got things like decentralized automated organizations popping up around the world. And what that is in this new world, of blockchain, normally, if I'm a regulator and something goes wrong with the company, I go to the board of directors. I go and I can, jail the board of director for fraud or whatever. What happens when there's no board of directors and that board of directors is code? So now we're having issues that, what are you going to do? Pull a piece of code into a court of law? I don't think so. Insolvency issues, which we've seen with when the FTX collapsed. Custody of these assets is incredibly problematic because it's not like holding gold in a vault or money in a bank. Like, there are so many intricacies that this technology can solve, but it also brings up problems that we've always looked when we're regulating in the back. We've always looked backwards, not forwards. So we're at this intersection of technology and regulation where we need to find new ways to ensure that we can regulate with technology. I think at some point code will be enforced as law, but I don't know how long that takes. So we're at this intersection. And the other most important thing that I've seen this year, which I find the most exciting thing, but also the most terrifying thing, is with the development of Web3. Web 2 was very static. The only people that made money out of Web 2 was like the Googles and the Facebooks that took all our information, did whatever they did with it and sold it. Web 3 has democratized that version of Web 2. So now you imagine with cryptocurrencies and virtual assets, we can move value and information at the same time to anybody anywhere in the world. So DeFi, decentralized finance, which is effectively each of us can be our own bank now. Peer-to-peer transactions have revolutionized everything from financial markets to every transaction we do in every vertical. And that's problematic too, because regulators regulate intermediaries traditionally. So what do we do now when we remove intermediaries out of systems and we have peer-to-peer transactions using any sort of digital asset or virtual asset? Should we be regulating it?
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah, so we were speaking before, we are seeing a problem where if you're sending ID and financial information, there are other consequences.
Yes.
You were saying.
There are unintended consequences that we haven't thought through because as regulators traditionally do what they did in the past. And then there's a breakdown too of how regulation works because I've always been regulated by security regulators. There is principle-based regulation and then there's risk-based regulation. They're two very different things. So the FATF uses what we call risk-based regulation. What is the risk of money laundering, terrorism in your jurisdiction? And that's very different to principle-based regulation, which the Financial Stability Board use and IOSCO. That's what happened in case law. There is principles around consumer investor protection because there's case law about all this stuff in jurisdictions. There's no case law, and risk-based regulation is very different. It's a completely different methodology. There's a complete methodology about how countries need to assess their risk for virtual assets. And there's a risk assessment that countries have to do. These things are very complicated, but they're very different from principle-based regulation. So now you've got all these requirements of different regulators and different standard setters imposing this on an industry, which is struggling to understand which regulator they should be listening to, which jurisdiction they should be going to. It'll solve itself, but we're less than 14 years into a technology. The internet took 35 years. From when Bob first built it, it was said it was only good for pornography and something else, gambling. That didn't happen. We all use the internet every day. But we're only 15 years into this technology. Like, we're very, very slow. But then you look at things like AI. So when ChatGPT came out, we've all known about that since 2012. I've been going to security meetings for over a decade when governments have known about it, and nobody managed to do anything. ChatGPT comes out, everyone starts to panic. Now, the uptake of that, how many people logged on to that when ChatGPT came out in 3 days? Mm-hmm. 17 million users in 3 days. So technology, and it took the internet 30 years to get where it is, not 3 days.
Yeah, it's every new tech that comes up is accelerating at a very fast pace. So coming back to what we're saying in terms of the regulation, going forward 5 years since we had the travel rule, which is the recommendation 16, what do you see in the next few years is there a way to solve this? Is this a communication thing, or what can we do to continue to improve?
So I think you and I have talked about this. Look, this is going to happen. The FATF have said that the travel rule will be implemented come high or low. It's going to happen. The technologists are very good at finding solutions. Like I don't underestimate the technologists. They always find a solution. They may not like it, but they will find a solution. But I think instead of it being virtual asset service providers, and we've spoken about this, Anson, the technology is now capable of tracking transactions. So I don't think it's going to be at a VASP level. I think it's going to be monitoring a transaction at the base layer, at the infrastructure layer, which the technology can do. So actually at the transactional level, not at the VASP level.
Yes.
And I think that's going to be really, really crucial to making sure that the requirements of the FATF is actually met by the industry. Because I think at the moment, it's going to be almost impossible for virtual asset service providers in themselves as companies to comply with recommendations.
That's right. So yes, at the intermediary level is actually very difficult. From all the compliance officers, especially in Singapore, we talk to, we are all trying to comply with the travel rule on that level and use multiple intermediaries. So yes, as going forward, we hope that FATF and other regulators see that the industry really wants to push it forward, but just needs to find a way that we can communicate better, right? And also FATF was asking, just at the meeting, how to collaborate with the private sector much better. So to end this, if you have one more nugget that you want to tell the audience, what would you say in terms of regulation, be it the regulators listening to this or the industry?
I think for the first time in history, we are seeing collaboration between industry and policymakers, because we've all figured out technologists are not policy writers and policy writers are technologists, and you have to be both. To work, you have to be multi-skilled. It's no longer good just to be a lawyer or an accountant. This technology affects everybody. But I think like after today, I think the FATF are becoming very, very good at listening to us. And these collaborative private-public partnership meetings, every time we go to one, something good comes out of it.
Yes.
And there's one in Paris next week with the industry. We will solve the problems of the travel rule, but I don't think the travel rule is going to look like it was written in 2019. I think the new paradigm shift is where code and technology can afford to actually make regulation and policy better. Because to be honest, like nobody in our industry, maybe less than 1%, nobody wants, money launderers, people to blow each other up, little girls to be trafficked. Nobody wants that. And if we all work with the common goal, if that's what we're trying to stop, we will all manage to do it.
Thank you, Loretta. This is definitely a very good conversation for people that want to be in compliance and know what's going on in the regulatory space. So thanks again. And look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.